What if I told you that a thin wall of frozen water was more reliable protection from death than a stone fortress? On the Great Plains, where night falls suddenly and storms turn the world into a white hell, the temperature could kill a person faster than hunger or wild animals. Where there were no caves, rocks, or dense forests, the indigenous peoples of North America did not rely on shelter. They created it themselves from what others considered a threat. To Europeans, it looked like magic. How could you take shelter from snow, which itself kills? But the peoples of the plains knew that cold is not the enemy if you understand its laws. They used snow not as an obstacle, but as a building material that works on the same principles as stone, only lighter, more flexible, and warmer. Dense, compacted snow became a wall that retained body heat better than any fabric and protected against the wind that tore at the skin. It was this knowledge that created a system of survival honed over centuries. They knew how to build a fire where there was not a single tree, using materials that Europeans would never have thought of calling fuel. They knew how to set up a place to sleep right in the snow so that their bodies stayed dry and their breath didn't turn their shelter into an icy trap. Their methods were so precise that they could sleep in conditions where an untrained person could die in minutes. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the peoples of North America made fire in the icy desert without a single twig, what tricks they used to sleep directly in the snow without frostbite, and why this thin wall of frozen water was more reliable than any fort built by Europeans. What if I showed you that snow is not cold, but warm? For modern people, snowdrifts are associated exclusively with frostbite and death. But for the peoples of the subarctic and northern plains, it was the #1 building material. The secret lies in the unique structure of snow cover, which consists not only of ice crystals, but also of a huge amount of air. This air, trapped between snowflakes, creates an ideal thermal insulation cushion that works on the principle of a modern thermos. The Indians understood this property perfectly. So during a blizzard, they did not try to escape the snow, but on the contrary, buried themselves as deep as possible. Hunters caught in bad weather far from camp built temporary shelters, which Europeans would later call quints or snow dens. This was not a chaotic burrowing into a snowdrift, but a well-thought-out engineering process requiring knowledge and skill. First, a large pile of snow was raked together and compacted, allowing it time to settle and harden in the cold. Only then was a cavity carefully dug out inside, taking care not to damage the integrity of the outer dome. It was important to leave the walls thick enough so that they would not collapse, but thin enough to allow some air to pass through. Inside such a shelter, the temperature always remained around 0 degrees, even when it was -40 outside. The heat of the human body reflecting off the snow walls warmed the small interior space to a livable temperature. The walls melted from the inside due to breathing, forming a thin ice crust that served as an additional windbreak. This ice glaze sealed the pores of the snow, preventing drafts, but at the same time, the structure required a ventilation hole. Without a small hole in the ceiling, a person could simply suffocate from lack of oxygen, even while staying warm. Experienced survivalists knew that the entrance to such a shelter should be located below the floor level where a person sleeps. This allowed the creation of a so-called cold pit where heavy cold air from outside flowed. Warm air, being lighter, rose and accumulated under the dome, exactly where the hunter was. Such simple but ingenious thermodynamics allowed one to survive the most terrible night without fire or warm blankets. European travelers who saw this method for the first time were shocked at how comfortable the Indians felt inside the ice blocks. The indigenous inhabitants of the plains also used snow to protect their portable dwellings, covering the lower edge of the tepee with dense blocks of snow. This created an additional barrier against the wind, which in open spaces was more dangerous than the frost itself. The snow mound around the dwelling acted as a foundation, preventing cold air from blowing up from below under the skins. Thus, the very element that threatened life became the main protector of people from hypothermia. This required enormous physical effort, as the snow had to be packed tightly, turning it into a monolith. However, the use of snow required strict discipline and control over the condition of clothing. It was essential to prevent snow from getting inside the clothing and melting there from body heat, as moisture instantly destroyed the thermal insulation. Therefore, before entering a snow shelter, clothing was carefully shaken off with special bone beaters. This ritual was mandatory for everyone, from experienced warriors to young hunters who were hunting for the first time. Violating this rule could result in a person freezing to death in their own shelter. The Indians also knew how to use natural hollows and ravines covered with snow, saving energy on construction. They found places where the wind had already piled up huge snowdrifts and simply modified them to suit their needs. Often, such natural shelters were located on the leeward side of hills, where the snow was the densest and deepest. This reduced the time needed to prepare for the night, which was critically important in rapidly deteriorating weather conditions. Every minute spent in the biting wind took away precious calories needed to keep the body warm. There were also simpler options for short-term overnight stays when there was no time to build a full-fledged snow hut. A person could dig a narrow trench, lie down in it, and cover themselves with skins, allowing the snow to cover them. The snow falling from above created an additional blanket, insulating the person from the outside environment. The main thing was to move periodically so that the snow cover did not become too heavy and suffocate them. In the morning, the hunter simply climbed out from under the snow, like a bear from its den, and continued on their way. This survival technique was passed down from generation to generation and was considered a basic skill for any man of the tribe. Boys were taught to feel the structure of the snow, distinguish between its types, and choose the right place to spend the night from an early age. They knew that loose, fresh snow was bad for building, and old, compacted snow was ideal. This knowledge was not recorded in books, but in the collective memory of a people living in harmony with the harsh, natural environment. Would you risk spending the night in a snow cave in the middle of the endless steppe? Write in the comments if you would trust your life to a snowdrift. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about survival. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of food? We are used to thinking that we need clothes or a fire to keep warm, but the Indians knew that the main source of heat is inside us. To survive in the bitter cold, when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, it was not enough to simply shelter from the wind. The body required a tremendous amount of fuel to maintain body temperature and prevent the blood from turning to ice. Therefore, the diet of indigenous peoples in winter was radically different from what they ate in the warmer months. The basis of the winter diet was pemmican, a unique product that can be called the great-grandfather of modern energy bars. It consisted of dried and powdered bison meat mixed with large amounts of melted fat and sometimes berries. Fat was a key ingredient as it provided the long-lasting energy that kept people warm from the inside for hours. Pemmican could be stored for years without spoiling, making it an ideal reserve in case of long blizzards or unsuccessful hunting. Europeans who tried pemmican for the first time often found its taste too specific and heavy on the stomach. However, for Native Americans, a piece of this product was equal to several hours of life in extreme cold. Its high-calorie content allowed the body to generate heat on an industrial scale, turning a person into a living stove. Warriors could go without hot food for several days, eating only dry pemmican and washing it down with snow water. Fat consumption increased significantly in winter, and this was dictated by pure survival physiology. Lean meat, rich in protein, did not have such a warming effect and required a lot of energy to digest. Fat, on the other hand, was absorbed differently, providing a powerful surge of energy and allowing metabolism to remain high. Tribes living on the plains specifically harvested bison fat and bone marrow before the onset of cold weather. Bone marrow was considered a real delicacy and the most valuable source of energy in winter. It was eaten raw or baked, and it instantly restored the strength of a frozen person. Hunters who killed an animal in winter would first cut open the bones to get access to this nutritious substance. It was like injecting pure fuel into the dying fire of the human body. Interestingly, Native Americans intuitively understood the principles of thermoregulation through food without knowing biochemistry. They knew that before going to sleep on a cold night, it was essential to eat a piece of fatty food. This triggered the digestive process, which raised the body temperature and prevented a person from freezing in their sleep. A hungry person froze much faster, so food was as much a means of protection as a fur coat. In addition to pemmican, they used reserves of dried meat, which was also prepared in huge quantities. Thin strips of dried bison meat were light but nutritious and could be chewed on the go. This meant that there was no need to stop to prepare food, which was important during migrations or military campaigns. Stopping meant cooling down, and cooling down in the steppe could be fatal. Water also played a critical role, as dehydration in the cold creeps it up on you slowly but surely. Eating snow was dangerous because it lowered body temperature, so they tried to melt it in flasks under their clothes. The heat of their own bodies turned the snow into water that could be drunk without the risk of hypothermia. This food system had been refined over centuries and allowed people to survive where even the most prepared expeditions perished. European colonists often died of hunger and cold, having supplies of flour and cereals but no fat. The Indians, on the other hand, with only a bag of pemmican, could survive a month in the snowy desert. The metabolism of the indigenous people adapted to these conditions, allowing them to process large amounts of fat without harm to their health. It was a veritable biological heat-producing machine, tuned to extreme conditions. Why do you think modern dietetics is so afraid of fats when they have saved people from death for centuries? Think about it as we move on to the next chapter, where we will reveal the secret of a home that breathes. What I am about to show you is hidden from the eyes of the average tourist and rarely mentioned in books. We are used to seeing the Indian tepee as a simple conical tent made of animal skins with a hole at the top. But if it were that simple, the inhabitants of the plains would have frozen to death in the first winter. The real magic of engineering was not in the outer shell, but in what was inside and remained invisible from the outside. The secret to comfortable wintering in a tepee lies in the use of a special inner lining called an ozon or devcloth. This inner wall of leather was attached to poles at human height and descended to the ground. It created an air gap between the outer skin of the tepee and the living space inside. This gap acted as an insulator, preventing the icy air from outside from reaching the people inside. The cold air, being heavy, remained in this corridor between the walls without penetrating the living area. But the main function of this design was to create ideal draft for the hearth. The air coming from below under the outer cover passed between the walls upward and exited through the smoke hole. This created a powerful flow that pulled the smoke from the fire outside, preventing it from accumulating inside the dwelling. Thanks to this, it was possible to build a fire in the tepee without fear of suffocating in the smoke, which was impossible in a regular tent. This ventilation system also provided a constant supply of fresh air to the fire, causing it to burn brightly and hotly. Without the inner lining, the fire would have smoked, and drafts would have blown throughout the dwelling, blowing out precious heat. The Indians essentially invented a complex climate control system that used the laws of physics to manage airflows. In winter, the space between the walls was often filled with dry grass for additional insulation. The grass created another layer of insulation, turning the tepee into a real thermos with thick walls. Even when the wind howled outside, strong enough to knock a bison off its feet, it was quiet and relatively warm inside the tepee. The temperature by the fire could be comfortable enough to sit without outer clothing. This allowed women to sew and men to repair weapons even on the harshest days. An important element was the shape of the dwelling itself, which was ideally suited to the wind loads of the open plains. The cone is streamlined, and winds of any strength simply flow around it, having no point of support to overturn the structure. The slope of the walls also allowed for the most efficient use of heat from the central hearth, reflecting it downwards onto the people. Unlike cubic rooms, where heat accumulates under the ceiling, in a tepee it circulated around the inhabitants. In winter, the entrance to the tepee was closed with a special door made of skin, often lined with fur, which fit tightly against the opening. Sometimes a small vestibule was built out of branches and skins to prevent cold air from rushing in when entering and exiting. This airlock system helped maintain the microclimate inside, minimizing heat loss. Every detail of the dwelling was thought out to the smallest detail and served one purpose: to preserve heat. The floor of the tepee was not bare earth either. It was covered with a thick layer of branches, skins, and mats. This insulated people from the frozen ground, which could draw all the heat from the body in one night. Sleeping places were located around the perimeter, away from drafts but close enough to the fire. The tepee's design allowed it to be quickly assembled and disassembled, which was vital for nomadic peoples. But even in a temporary camp, they always installed an inner lining if cold weather was expected. This was not a convenience, but a necessity, a matter of life and death. Thus, the tepee is not a primitive hut, but a high-tech device for survival in a hostile environment. It combines aerodynamics, thermodynamics, and material science at a level accessible to Stone Age people. Do you agree that ancient technologies sometimes surpass modern solutions? Like this if you are also impressed by this engineering feat. What if I told you that your modern jacket wouldn't last a day on the prairies of the 18th century? Native American clothing didn't just cover nakedness, it was a complex life support system. The main material was the leather and fur of the bison, an animal that nature had perfectly prepared for harsh winters. Bison hide has unique properties. It is incredibly durable, but when properly tanned, it becomes soft and flexible. The secret to warmth lay in layering and using the fur correctly depending on the weather. Indians wore fur capes with the fur on the inside to create an air layer against the body. The air trapped between the fur fibers was heated by the body and prevented the cold from penetrating the skin. On the outside, the leather surface protected against wind and moisture, acting like a modern membrane. Tanning hides was an art mastered by the women of the tribe, and the process was long and laborious. They used a method of brain tanning. Animal brains were rubbed into the skin to make it soft and water-resistant. Such leather did not stiffen in the cold, remaining elastic, which allowed for free movement and hunting. If clothing became stiff, it could rub the skin until it bled or restrict movement at a critical moment. Special attention was paid to footwear. Moccasins, as feet freeze first. Winter moccasins were sewn from bison hide with the fur on the inside, making them taller and roomier than summer ones. The extra space was necessary for the main secret to keeping feet warm: dry grass. The Indians stuffed their moccasins with soft dry grass or moss, creating an additional insulating layer. This grass insole absorbed excess moisture from sweat, keeping the feet dry. If the grass got wet, it was simply thrown away and replaced with new grass, which was abundant on the prairies. It was an ingenious solution to the problem of hygiene and thermal insulation without the need for washing and drying. No modern socks can compare in effectiveness to this natural material. Leather leggings were also used to cover the legs from the ankle to the thigh. They were attached to the belt and protected against thorny bushes and deep snow. Combined with a long loincloth and shirt, this provided reliable protection for the entire body. It was important that the clothing was not too tight so as not to restrict blood circulation. Mittens were also sewn from fur-lined leather, often attached to a cord thrown over the neck. This allowed them to be quickly removed for archery or knife work without fear of losing them in the snow. Losing a mitten in a blizzard could cost a person their fingers or even their hand. Heavy bison robes served as outerwear, a single skin that was thrown over the shoulders like a cloak. The robe was not just clothing, but a mobile home. You could wrap yourself up in it and sleep on the snow. Robes were often painted with stories of a warrior's exploits, which gave them spiritual power. Even in the most severe frosts, the Indians tried not to overheat during active movement. They knew that sweat meant death, as wet clothes freeze instantly as soon as a person stops moving. Therefore, they skillfully regulated heat exchange by opening their robes or removing excess layers. This clothing was the result of thousands of years of natural selection of technologies. The tribes that learned to sew better and more efficiently survived. What do you think was more important for survival at night? Good clothing or something else? In the next chapter, you will learn how people used each other to keep from freezing to death. When the frost became so severe that even the fire in the tepee could not warm everyone, biology came into play. The Indians understood perfectly well that the human body is a heat generator, and several generators work better than one. The practice of sleeping together was not a matter of ethics or convenience, but a strict necessity for survival. On cold nights, families would lie down to sleep in a tight group, creating a single heat core. There was a strict order for placing people to sleep in such conditions. The most vulnerable were always placed in the center, small children and the elderly, whose thermoregulation was weaker. They were surrounded by women, and the outer circle was made up of adult men and teenagers. The men created a living shield with their bodies, taking on the cold coming from the walls of the tepee. This arrangement allowed those who could not generate enough heat on their own to survive. The heat exchange in such a pile was enormous, and the temperature inside the group could be tens of degrees higher than outside. They covered themselves with large animal skins sewn together to create one huge blanket for everyone. This was much more effective than if each person had covered themselves with their own separate skin. Dogs were often taken under these shared blankets, serving as living hot water bottles. Dogs in Indian camps were not just pets or guards, but also an important part of the heating system. Their body temperature is higher than that of humans, and several large dogs could significantly add warmth to sleeping people. In such cramped conditions, the concept of personal space completely disappeared, giving way to collective survival. People warmed each other with their breath and the heat of their skin, creating a microclimate in which it was possible to survive the night. This strengthened social ties within the tribe, making the family a single organism, not only metaphorically, but also physically. If someone began to shake violently or show signs of hypothermia, they were immediately moved closer to the center of the group. The bodies of their neighbors acted as a form of resuscitation, restoring warmth to the frozen person. No one was left alone in the cold. Loneliness in winter was tantamount to suicide. This practice also extended to military units on campaigns without women and children. Soldiers slept in pairs or threes, covered by a single cloak, and pressed their backs against each other. This was called brotherhood of warmth, and refusing to sleep next to a comrade could be considered madness. Even during the day, sitting by the fire, people tried to stay shoulder to shoulder, minimizing heat loss. They sat in a circle, shielding the fire from the wind with their backs and creating an enclosed space. Each person was part of a living wall protecting the others. Psychologically, this feeling of togetherness also helped them survive the long, dark nights. The feeling that you were not alone in the icy abyss gave you the strength to fight and wait for dawn. Fear receded when the hearts of your loved ones and friends were beating nearby. This strategy of group survival is as old as the world itself, but it was on the plains that it reached perfection. People became one to resist the elements that wanted to kill them. What if I told you that the best protection from the wind is the earth itself? Sometimes a blizzard would catch travelers in the open steppe, where there was no time to build shelter. The steppe wind was so fierce that it knocked people off their feet and took their breath away in seconds. Open spaces became traps where any delay was fatal. In such conditions, it was necessary to act instantly, relying on experience and instinct. The Indians knew that the earth could be more reliable than any tent. In such extreme situations, the Indians used the terrain as their only salvation. They looked for deep ravines, hollows, dry creek beds, and any shelter where the wind lost its strength. Even a small hollow could mean the difference between life and death. People memorized such places in advance so as not to waste time searching. When danger threatened, they sought shelter in the lowlands as quickly as possible. The steppe dictated its own rules, and those who knew how to read the landscape survived. In these depressions, they dug temporary earthen burrows or deepened existing gullies. Even frozen ground retains heat better than open air and provides complete protection from the wind. Digging a shelter in frozen ground was an extremely difficult task, but fear gave them strength. People worked to their limits, trying to deepen the hole by at least a few dozen centimeters. Even such a small depression dramatically increased the chances of survival. The earth became a natural wall between man and the elements. There were almost no tools. They used knives, tomahawks, animal horns, and even flat stones to chip away at the frozen ground. Their hands quickly went numb from the cold, but they couldn't stop. Every extra meter dug was precious time gained from the wind. Sometimes people dug in turns, taking turns to conserve their strength. What they created could not be called a dwelling, but it saved lives. From above, they covered such a hole with skins, branches of shrubs, or snow if there was nothing else. The result was a hiding place, invisible from the outside, but a lifesaver for those inside. Even a thin skin could retain some of the heat, creating a semblance of a roof. It was impossible to stand inside, only to lie or sit, curled up in a ball. But it was this small space that quickly filled with warm air from their breath. People waited out the storm, listening to the howling wind that could no longer reach them. The heat in such a burrow was maintained thanks to the enclosed space. Their bodies warmed the air, and the ground prevented the wind from penetrating inside. The snow cover acted as additional insulation. Outside, everything seemed cold and alien, but inside, the difference in temperature began to be felt. Sometimes there were several people in the burrow at once, which allowed the temperature to rise faster. In such conditions, not only strength, but also calmness was important. If the group had horses, they were used as a living wall to protect against the wind. The animals were lined up on the windward side, and people took shelter behind their backs. The horses understood the danger and huddled together, reducing the force of the wind. Their massive bodies created a strip of silence where the wind could hardly penetrate. For people, this living wall was a real barrier. The warmth of the animals spread to those standing nearby. Sometimes the horses were made to lie down on the ground, and people lay between them, using their bodies as sources of heat. This was risky, as a frightened animal could suddenly stand up or move. But when the temperature dropped to the limit, there was almost no choice. At such moments, humans and animals became allies. The horses sensed the touch of humans and remained calmer. These scenes show how deep the connection between Native Americans and their animals was. In some cases, hunters found old animal burrows and enlarged them. These could be wolf dens or abandoned bear dens. The risk was enormous because the owner could return, but the cold was more frightening than an encounter with a predator. People relied on experience to determine how long ago the burrow had been abandoned. The soil from such shelters was thrown outside, widening the entrance and deepening the floor. The finished natural niche provided extra minutes for rescue. Such natural shelters were worth their weight in gold. Hunters memorized their locations and passed on their knowledge. Sometimes they even marked a nearby stone or unusual branch. In fog or snowfall, such landmarks could save lives. The shelter became a point of safety that people carried in their memory. It was part of an invisible map of the area created by generations. Saddles, blankets, or cut-dry weeds were used to insulate the bottom of the earthen pit. Any layer between the body and the ground increased the chances of survival. The ground drew heat away very quickly, and it was necessary to get away from it at least a little. Sometimes people would lay their bags, skins, or even clothes that they could spare under themselves. The main thing was to protect the kidneys and lungs from the icy cold below. This could determine the outcome of the night. If the weeds were dry, they were gathered in armfuls. They created a soft, porous bedding. This layer worked like a primitive mattress. It trapped air, which was quickly heated by the human body. After a few minutes, a small area of warmth appeared. It was not much, but it was enough to survive the frosty night. Earth shelters were dirty, cramped, and dark, but they provided the most important thing: protection from the wind. The wind on the plains was called White Death because it blew the heat out of a person in an instant. People knew that you could live a day without food and many hours without water, but without protection from the wind, you couldn't live even an hour. Therefore, hiding from it was more important than any other action. The earth became the first and last shield. Sometimes a person would spend not just an hour in such a shelter, but the whole night. In the darkness, you could hear the howling of the wind, the pounding of snowflakes, and the crunching of ice. But inside there was relative silence. People dozed in short bursts, periodically checking each other's breathing. Fear gradually gave way to concentration. At such moments, they understood the value of every breath. What do you think the Indians did when they had the opportunity to build a permanent home? In the next chapter, you will learn about earthen prairie forts. Unlike the nomadic tribes who lived in teepees, some peoples, such as the Mandan and Hidatsa, built real earthen houses. These structures, called earth lodges, were masterpieces of primitive architecture and insulation. They were huge dome-shaped structures with a frame made of sturdy logs. But the main secret was not the wood, but the thick layer of earth and sod that covered the roof and walls. A layer of earth, half a meter thick or more, created an incredible thermal mass that smoothed out temperature fluctuations. In winter, this earthen coat kept the heat inside, and in summer it kept the coolness, like in a cellar. The earth worked like a battery. It slowly heated up from the hearth in the sun, and just as slowly gave off heat at night. Inside such a house, the temperature was always above zero, even without intensive heating. The entrance to an earthen house was usually protected by a long corridor vestibule, which was also covered with earth. This tunnel blocked out the cold air and served as a place to store firewood and equipment. To get to the living area, you had to go through two curtains made of heavy bison hides. This system completely eliminated drafts, making the house airtight. Several families could live inside the earthen bed, and their best horses could also be housed there. The presence of animals inside the house added warmth, although it created certain odors to which the inhabitants were accustomed. The hearth was located in the center, under the smoke hole, and its heat spread evenly throughout the circular room. The floor in such houses was often sunk into the ground, which used the geothermal heat of the soil. The deeper into the ground, the more stable the temperature, and the Indians knew this very well. The walls inside were covered with wood or mats to prevent the earth from crumbling and for additional comfort. The earthen lodges were so sturdy that you could walk on their roofs, and people often gathered there in good weather. But in winter, the roof became just another layer of snow, which provided additional insulation for the house. The snow on the roof did not melt, which indicated excellent thermal insulation. The heat did not escape outside. These structures could stand for decades, requiring only periodic repairs to the wooden frame. They were real fortresses against winter, capable of withstanding any blizzards and frosts. Life in an earthen bed was much more comfortable and safer than in a tepee, but it required a settled lifestyle. The construction of such a house was a collective effort of the entire tribe and took a long time. Logs had to be dragged from far away, from floodplain forests, and earth had to be carried in baskets. But the result justified all the effort, providing people with reliable protection. The Mandan earthen houses impressed the first explorers with their size and comfort inside. They were real underground palaces where life continued even in the most severe frosts. Ceremonies were held in them, legends were told, and the tribe waited out the winter in warmth and safety. These houses proved that Native Americans did not simply adapt to their environment, but actively changed it to suit their needs. They used readily available materials, wood and earth, to create the ideal living environment. If we move northeast to the Iroquois, we see a different survival strategy: longhouses. These were huge structures made of elm bark, reaching up to 100 meters in length. An entire clan lived in such a house, dozens of families under one roof, which in itself solved the problem of heating. The elm bark used for cladding was an excellent insulator, protecting against wind and snow. Inside the longhouse, there was a row of hearths along the entire length, each of which heated two families living opposite each other. The smoke escaped through openings in the roof, which could be regulated by pieces of bark, closing or opening them. This system allowed a constant temperature to be maintained throughout the entire huge room. The many fires created a single heat field, preventing the house from cooling down. The sleeping areas were located on raised platforms along the walls, about half a meter above the ground. This was important because the coldest air accumulated near the floor, and it was warmer on the raised platforms. The platforms were covered with skins and mats, creating soft and warm beds. Firewood and food supplies were stored under the platforms, which also created an additional buffer from the cold walls. In winter, the cracks in the bark walls were caulked with moss and clay to eliminate any drafts. The entrances, located at the ends of the house, were covered with heavy skins and often had vestibules. The longhouse was always crowded, and the warmth of many bodies also contributed to the heating. Life in such a communal dwelling required a high degree of social organization and tolerance. People cooked, worked, and slept side by side, sharing warmth and resources. This brought the clan together and allowed the elderly and sick, who were cared for by everyone, to survive. A lone individual in the forests of the Northeast was doomed, but the clan was invincible. Special attention was paid to gathering firewood, which began long before winter. Huge wood piles surrounded the village, creating windbreaks. Firewood was the currency of survival, and every man was obliged to replenish the supplies. On the coldest days, dances and games were held inside the longhouse to get the blood flowing and lift the spirits. Physical activity in a confined space helped to keep warm and combat winter depression. The architecture of the longhouse was perfectly suited to the climate of the forest zone with heavy snowfall. The sloping roof prevented snow from accumulating in dangerous quantities, and the bark did not rot from moisture. These were reliable, durable dwellings that served people for years. The culture of the Iroquois was largely shaped around this dwelling, which became a symbol of their confederation. People of the longhouse, well, that's what they called themselves, emphasizing unity and a common roof over their heads. This unity was the main secret of their survival and power. The longhouse is an example of how architecture shapes society, and society adapts architecture to the climate. It was a symbiosis of people and their dwellings that allowed them to thrive in harsh conditions. On the Great Plains, where trees grow only along rivers, finding firewood in winter was a huge problem. However, the Indians found a substitute for wood that lay literally at their feet. We are talking about bison chips, dried bison dung, which was the main fuel in the steppe. This material, despite its unattractive appearance, had amazing combustible properties. Dry dung burned slowly, with an even flame, giving off a lot of heat and little smoke. Unlike wood, which burns quickly, a pile of chips could smolder all night, keeping the tepee warm. The smoke from this fuel had a specific smell, but the Indians said that it repelled mosquitoes in the summer and warmed the soul in the winter. Gathering this fuel was the responsibility of women and children, and they harvested it by the ton. In winter, it was difficult to find dry manure under the snow, so they made reserves in advance, storing them in dry places. If the reserves ran out, they had to look for places where the wind had blown the snow away and chipped the frozen patties off the ground. It was hard work, but without fire, life on the steppe was impossible. In forested areas, they used dead wood, but never cut down living trees in winter, as wet wood burns poorly and gives off little heat. The Indians knew which types of wood gave off more heat and which only smoldered. Birch bark was used for kindling, as it ignites even when wet. The ability to start a fire in a blizzard was an art on which the life of the entire group depended. Fire was carried in special horns or pots with smoldering coals so as not to waste time striking sparks. Losing coals was considered a disgrace and a terrible misfortune. Sometimes animal bones were used, which thanks to their high-fat content also burned well. It was the fuel of desperation when there was nothing else, but it saved lives. The fat dripping from the bones kept the flame burning, even in strong winds. The fire in the tepee was lit in a special way, making it small but effective. The stones around the hearth heated up and continued to give off heat even after the fire had gone out. These hot stones were sometimes placed in bed or used to boil water. Fire was not just a source of heat, it was the sacred center of the dwelling, a symbol of life. It was treated with respect, fed with pieces of food and tobacco. The extinction of the fire was perceived as a bad sign and a harbinger of trouble. In conditions of fuel scarcity, Native Americans learned to cook food with minimal energy expenditure. They used a simmering method, placing the pot on coals rather than on an open fire. This saved precious fuel and made the meat tender. The ability to find fuel where white people saw only empty plains was one of the main survival skills. This ability to see resources in everything that nature provides distinguished the indigenous people from the newcomers. The most important tool for Native American survival was not their tools or skins, but their own minds. Psychological preparation for the cold began in early childhood and shaped a special type of personality. Children were taught that the cold was not an enemy, but a part of the world that had to be accepted and endured. Crying from the cold was considered shameful and unworthy of a future warrior. Stoicism was the norm. Complaining about the weather was not accepted, as it did not change the situation and only wasted mental energy. The Indians knew how to enter a special state of mental calm by slowing down their breathing and heartbeat. This helped them conserve energy and feel less pain from the cold. They could sit motionless for hours, wrapped in their robes, waiting for the weather to improve. An important aspect was the absence of panic in critical situations. If a storm took them by surprise, the Indians acted clearly and calmly, following well-rehearsed algorithms. Panic leads to chaotic actions, sweating, and quick death, and they knew this very well. A cool head was the best weapon against the cold wind. There were special rituals and cold tests for young men preparing to become warriors. They could be sent into the forest in winter with minimal clothing and equipment to prove their resilience. Those who survived returned as men who knew that their spirit was stronger than the frost. This gave them self-confidence, which helped in real dangerous situations. Belief in spirits and the help of ancestors also played a huge role in maintaining morale. Prayers and songs helped distract from physical suffering and focus on survival. Native Americans believed that they were not alone. that the forces of nature were watching over them, and this gave them strength. The ability to read the signs of nature allowed them to predict a storm long before it began and prepare for it. They observed the behavior of animals, changes in the wind, and the color of the sky. This gave them a sense of control over the situation, relieving them of the fear of the unknown. Knowledge is also a form of psychological defense. An atmosphere of mutual support and encouragement was maintained within the community. Laughter and jokes around the campfire were essential to prevent despondency from taking hold of people's souls. Despondency was considered a disease that weakened the body and made it vulnerable to the cold. The Indians perceived winter as a time of rest and storytelling, not a time of suffering. This positive reinterpretation of the season helped them survive the long months of cold. They waited for winter, prepared for it, and respected its power. Psychological resilience was the foundation on which all other survival techniques were built. Without a strong spirit, neither clothing nor fire could save a person in the icy wilderness. Victory over the cold began in the mind. This mental armor was perhaps the most valuable legacy that the elders passed on to the young. And this is precisely what Europeans, who perceived nature as an enemy, often lacked. We have seen that the survival of indigenous peoples on snowy nights was a combination of unique technologies, biological adaptation, and iron willpower. From using snow as insulation to eating pure fat, every aspect of their lives was subordinated to one goal: to stay warm. They did not conquer nature but dissolved into it, becoming part of the harsh landscape. Their experience proves that human intelligence is capable of finding a way out of any trap, even the most icy one. What impressed you the most? The snow burrows or how they used manure for heating? Suggest a topic for the next video that you would like to learn more about in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover forgotten pages of survival history with us.